In June 1762, a woman put on a soldier's uniform, mounted a horse, and rode at the head of an army toward the palace where her own husband was staying. She was not Russian. She had been born a minor German princess with no significant fortune and no obvious path to real power. She had been sent to Russia at just 14 years old, married off to a man who turned out to be temperamentally unsuited for the throne he would eventually inherit. For 18 years, she had watched. She had studied Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian politics with extraordinary dedication. She had built quiet alliances within the military and the court. She had waited, and when her husband had been Tsar of Russia for only 6 months, during which he had alienated the military, the church, and the nobility through a series of unpopular decisions, she made her move. Within days, he was arrested. Within a week, he was dead, under circumstances that have never been fully explained. And the German princess who had arrived in Russia with almost nothing became Catherine the Great. She would go on to rule Russia for 34 years, transforming it into one of the great powers of Europe. This is her story, and it is one of the most audacious power seizures in all of history. Catherine the Great was born Sophie Friederike Auguste on May 2, 1729, in the German city of Stettin, in what was then Prussia. Her family was minor nobility, respectable, but not wealthy or particularly influential by the standards of European royalty. Her father was a Prussian army officer and minor prince. Her mother was ambitious and socially connected, and it was largely through her mother's efforts that young Sophie's marriage prospects were pursued. From an early age, Sophie showed unusual intelligence and curiosity. She read constantly. She was interested in ideas, in philosophy, in the workings of power, unusual interests for a girl in her position and era. Her mother often found her too serious, too intellectually intense for a young noblewoman whose main value on the marriage market was supposed to be charm and appearance rather than sharp thinking. In 1744, when Sophie was 14, an opportunity arrived that would change everything. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who had no children of her own, had chosen her nephew, Peter, as heir to the Russian throne. Empress Elizabeth was now searching for a suitable bride for Peter, and Sophie's family connections made her a candidate. Sophie and her mother traveled to Russia. The match was arranged. Sophie converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy, taking the name Catherine, Yekaterina in Russian. She was formally betrothed to Peter, and in 1745, at the age of 16, she married him. She had left Germany as an obscure minor princess. She arrived in Russia as the future wife of an emperor. She had no idea what she was actually walking into. Catherine's marriage to Peter was, by nearly every account, deeply unhappy from the very beginning. Peter was, by most historical descriptions, immature, erratic, and poorly suited to the responsibilities that awaited him. He remained fascinated with toy soldiers and military games well into adulthood. Treating actual affairs of state with a similar lack of seriousness, he openly admired Prussia and its King Frederick the Great, to a degree that many Russians found deeply troubling in a future Russian emperor. He showed little interest in Russian culture, Russian Orthodox religious practice, or in genuinely understanding the country he would one day rule. The marriage itself was reportedly not consummated for years. Historians have debated the exact reasons, ranging from Peter's possible medical issues to simple immaturity and lack of interest. This created enormous pressure on Catherine, since producing an heir was considered essential to her position and value at court. While Peter occupied himself with his own interests, largely ignoring his wife, Catherine made a very different choice. She threw herself into learning. She studied the Russian language with real dedication, eventually becoming fluent, something Peter, despite growing up partly in Russia, never fully achieved. She read voraciously, philosophy, history, and the works of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu, whose ideas about governance, reason, and reform would deeply influence her own later rule. She studied Russian Orthodox religious practice seriously and sincerely in a way that endeared her to the Russian Church and people in ways her husband never managed. She also began, carefully and quietly, to build relationships within the Russian court, with military officers, with nobles, with people who held real influence. She was learning not just about Russia, but about how power actually worked within it. In 1754, Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul. Though the identity of the child's biological father has been a subject of historical speculation for centuries, given the strained state of her marriage to Peter. Regardless of parentage, the birth secured the succession and strengthened Catherine's position at court. Through all of this, Catherine was playing an extraordinarily long and patient game. She was positioning herself, and she was watching her husband's popularity and competence steadily decline. In January 1762, Empress Elizabeth died. Peter became Emperor Peter III of Russia. Catherine became his empress consort. Peter's reign lasted just 6 months, and in that short time, he managed to alienate nearly every important power base in Russian society. He immediately withdrew Russia from its ongoing war against Prussia, a war that Russia had actually been winning at significant cost, and returned conquered territory to Prussia's King Frederick the Great, whom Peter openly idolized. Russian military officers who had fought and died in that war were furious at what looked like the betrayal of everything they had sacrificed for. He introduced Prussian-style military uniforms and drilling procedures for the Russian army, further alienating military leadership who saw this as an insulting rejection of Russian military tradition in favor of foreign practices. He threatened significant reforms to the Russian Orthodox Church, including proposals to seize church lands and property, deeply upsetting religious leaders and devout members of the court and nobility. He made little effort to hide his contempt for Russian customs, Russian culture, and even for his own wife, whom he treated with public disrespect and reportedly discussed replacing with his mistress. Within just 6 months, Peter III had managed to offend the military, the church, and significant parts of the nobility. Nearly every group whose support an emperor needed to remain secure on the Russian throne. Catherine, who had spent 18 years carefully building relationships with exactly these groups, the military officers, the church leaders, the influential nobles, watched her husband dismantle his own support with what must have been a mixture of horror and calculation. The opportunity she may have quietly hoped for, or at minimum recognized as increasingly possible, was arriving faster than perhaps even she expected. By June 1762, Catherine had built a network of supporters that included key officers in the Imperial Guard, the elite military units stationed in and around St. Petersburg, who had historically played a decisive role in determining who actually held power in Russia, regardless of formal succession rules. Among her most important allies were the Orlov brothers, a group of guard officers, one of whom, Grigory Orlov, was also Catherine's lover at the time and the father of a son she had with him. The Orlov brothers had extensive connections throughout the Guard regiments and were instrumental in organizing military support for Catherine. On June 28, 1762, while Peter was away from the capital at his residence at Oranienbaum, Catherine made her move. She traveled to St. Petersburg and went directly to the barracks of the Guard regiments. She addressed the soldiers directly, appealing to their loyalty to Russia and to Orthodox tradition, framing Peter's rule as a threat to both. Regiment after regiment swore their allegiance to her. She dressed in a guard's uniform herself, a powerful and deliberate symbolic choice, and rode at the head of the assembled troops toward Peterhof, where Peter was expected. The coup unfolded with remarkable speed and minimal violence. Peter, upon realizing the scale of what was happening and the completeness of his loss of support, offered essentially no resistance. He was persuaded to sign a formal document of abdication, giving up the throne without a fight. He was arrested and taken into custody at a country estate called Ropshaw, under guard. Catherine had achieved, in a matter of days, what she had spent nearly 2 decades quietly preparing for. She was now the ruler of Russia, But there was still the uncomfortable question of what to do with the deposed former emperor, her own husband, who remained alive, in custody, and a potential ongoing threat to her legitimacy as long as he lived. Just 8 days after his abdication, on July 17, 1762, Peter III died at Ropshaw while in custody. The official announcement given to the Russian public attributed his death to a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic, a claim that satisfied almost no one, then or since. What actually happened at Ropshaw has never been fully or conclusively established. The most widely accepted historical account, based on later testimony and circumstantial evidence, suggests that Peter died during or shortly after some kind of violent altercation involving his guards, possibly Alexei Orlov, brother of Catherine's lover Grigory Orlov, who was overseeing Peter's custody at Ropshaw. Whether Catherine directly ordered Peter's death, whether she was informed of a plan and chose not to prevent it, or whether the guards acted on their own initiative without her explicit direction, remains genuinely disputed among historians. No definitive documentary evidence has ever surfaced that proves Catherine personally ordered his killing. What is certain is that Peter's death was extremely convenient for Catherine's position. A living deposed emperor, even one who had abdicated, represented an ongoing potential rallying point for opposition to her rule. His death removed that risk entirely and permanently. Catherine's public reaction to the news was reportedly one of apparent shock and grief, at least in official settings, though how much of this reflected genuine feeling versus necessary political performance is impossible to know with certainty. Regardless of the precise truth of what happened at Ropshaw, Catherine now sat on the Russian throne without a living rival, with a stronger hereditary claim. She was the sole and unchallenged ruler of the Russian Empire. She was 33 years old. She would rule for the next 34 years. Having taken the throne through a coup rather than direct hereditary succession, Catherine faced an immediate and ongoing challenge, establishing genuine legitimacy as ruler of Russia. She was, after all, a German-born woman with no Russian royal blood, who had overthrown her own husband under circumstances that even sympathetic observers found troubling. She could not simply rely on tradition to secure her position. She had to actively earn and demonstrate her right to rule. Catherine approached this challenge with remarkable strategic skill. She was formally crowned in Moscow's Assumption Cathedral in September 1762, in a grand and traditional ceremony deliberately designed to emphasize continuity with Russian imperial and religious tradition. Despite the unconventional circumstances of her accession, she positioned herself as a devoted protector of the Russian Orthodox Church, reversing Peter's unpopular proposals to seize church property and instead presenting herself as a genuine defender of Orthodox tradition, winning crucial support from religious leaders throughout Russia. She cultivated the Russian military, particularly the Imperial Guard regiments that had been instrumental in bringing her to power, ensuring their continued loyalty through rewards, honors, and genuine attention to military affairs and success. She also began cultivating an image as an enlightened, intellectual, forward-thinking ruler, corresponding extensively with major European Enlightenment philosophers, including Voltaire, with whom she maintained a lengthy and famous correspondence for years. This positioned Russia, and Catherine personally, as sophisticated and engaged with the most progressive intellectual currents of the era, significantly enhancing Russia's international prestige and Catherine's own reputation as a serious and capable ruler. Slowly, methodically, and with clear strategic purpose, Catherine transformed herself from an usurper with a questionable claim into what would eventually be recognized as one of the most legitimate and successful rulers in all of Russian history. Catherine's 34-year reign was defined significantly by dramatic territorial expansion, transforming Russia's borders and its standing among the great powers of Europe. Through a series of successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, Russia gained crucial access to the Black Sea, along with significant new territories in the south, opening important new trade routes and strategic military positions that had eluded previous Russian rulers for generations. Catherine also played a central role in the partitions of Poland, a series of agreements between Russia, Prussia, and Austria that divided Polish territory among the three powers over multiple stages during her reign, ultimately eliminating Poland as an independent state entirely by 1795. Russia gained enormous new territories and population through these partitions, though the elimination of Poland as a sovereign nation remains a historically controversial and, for Poland, deeply painful legacy of this period. Under Catherine's rule, Russian territory expanded by hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, and the Russian population grew significantly through both territorial acquisition and general demographic growth. Russia's standing as a major European and global power was firmly and permanently established during her reign, in a way that would shape European politics for the following century and beyond. Catherine also pursued significant internal reforms and modernization efforts. She reorganized Russian provincial administration, worked to improve and expand Russian education, particularly for the nobility, and founded significant cultural and educational institutions, including the Hermitage Art Collection in St. Petersburg, which began as her own personal art collection and eventually grew into one of the largest and most significant art museums in the entire world. She corresponded with and hosted many of Europe's leading Enlightenment thinkers, positioning her court as a genuine center of intellectual and cultural sophistication that rivaled the great courts of Western Europe. Catherine's reputation as an enlightened ruler, genuinely influenced by progressive European philosophical ideas, existed alongside a much harsher reality for the vast majority of the Russian population. Russia during Catherine's reign remained a society built substantially on serfdom, a system in which the majority of the Russian peasant population was legally bound to the land and effectively owned by noble landowners, with extremely limited personal freedom or legal rights. Rather than reforming or reducing this system, as some of her early intellectual correspondence and stated ideals might have suggested she was inclined to do, Catherine's reign actually saw an expansion of serfdom's reach and a further entrenchment of noble landowners' power over the peasants who worked their land. This contradiction became especially starkly apparent following a massive peasant uprising known as the Pugachev Rebellion, which broke out in 1773 and grew into one of the largest peasant revolts in Russian history, led by a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed, falsely, to be the still-living Peter III, Catherine's supposedly dead husband. The rebellion, fueled by genuine and severe peasant grievances against harsh conditions and noble exploitation, spread across a significant portion of the Russian Empire before finally being crushed by Catherine's forces in 1774, with Pugachev captured, brought to Moscow, and executed. The rebellion appears to have significantly hardened Catherine's approach toward the peasantry and toward any perceived threat of instability from below. Rather than pursuing meaningful reform of serfdom in its aftermath, her later reign saw policies that generally reinforced and protected noble authority over peasants, reflecting a clear prioritization of maintaining the stability and loyalty of the noble class. The group whose support had originally brought her to power, and upon whom her continued rule fundamentally depended, over the broader implementation of the enlightened ideas and the practical political realities of ruling an empire substantially dependent on serf labor and noble loyalty remains one of the most significant and actively debated aspects of her historical legacy among historians studying her reign. Catherine the Great died on November 17, 1796, at the age of 67, having ruled Russia for 34 years. One of the longest reigns of any Russian monarch in the country's history. By the time of her death, she had transformed Russia in ways that would shape the country and the wider European political landscape for generations that followed. She had expanded Russian territory dramatically. She had firmly established Russia's position among the major powers of Europe. She had modernized aspects of Russian administration, education, and culture. She had built one of the world's great art collections. And she had maintained her position on the throne for over 3 decades. despite having taken power through means that many at the time considered, at best, deeply questionable. Her son Paul succeeded her as emperor. Paul, whose paternity had long been quietly questioned, and whose relationship with his mother throughout her reign had reportedly been distant and difficult, shaped in part by Catherine's own complicated history and her evident preference in many respects for her grandson over her son. Catherine's legacy remains genuinely complex and, among historians, actively debated even today. She is remembered as one of history's great state builders, a ruler who took an empire on uncertain footing and made it into a genuine European power. She is also remembered as a ruler whose personal engagement with Enlightenment philosophy did not translate into meaningful improvement in the lives of the vast majority of the people she ruled, and whose reign saw the further entrenchment of one of history's harsher systems of unfree labor. She remains, by nearly any historical assessment, one of the most consequential rulers in Russian history. A woman who arrived in Russia as an obscure foreign teenager with no meaningful power of her own, and who left it as the architect of one of the great empires of her era. Catherine the Great arrived in Russia at 14 years old, a minor German princess with no significant fortune, no Russian blood, and no obvious path to genuine power. She spent 18 patient years studying, learning, and quietly building the relationships and alliances that would eventually put her on the throne of the largest country on earth. When the moment came, she moved decisively, riding at the head of an army to claim a throne that history, tradition, and blood all said should never have been hers. She ruled for 34 years. She expanded an empire. She built one of the world's great museums. She corresponded with philosophers and reshaped how Russia was seen by the rest of Europe. And she did all of this while presiding over a system that kept millions of her own people in conditions of genuine unfreedom, a contradiction she never fully resolved, and one that historians continue to grapple with today. Was she great because of what she built? Or was greatness in her case simply another word for extraordinary ambition, extraordinary patience, and an extraordinary willingness to seize power however it needed to be seized? Perhaps in the end, she was both things at once, a builder and a usurper, an intellectual and a ruthless political survivor, a woman who read Enlightenment philosophy by candlelight and rode at the head of an army by dawn. That contradiction, more than any single achievement, may be the truest measure of who Catherine the Great really was. If Catherine the Great's story surprised you, drop a comment and tell me, do you think she deserves the title The Great? Or was she simply a ruthless opportunist who got lucky? I want to hear your take. Hit subscribe because every single day, Past Portraits brings you true stories from history just like this one. I will see you tomorrow.